Thank you. Sorry about that. I got ahead of myself here. Are we recording now? It says it. All right, it is. I used to get a little message that said it, and now the message. All right, I see it's recording up there. I just want to know for sure. Good. Not only is the first act, I'm going to take attendance in a second. Don't worry, Alex, Angelica. My brain is funding. Some cylinders are firing, but not all of them. Some of them are firing very well and very well oiled, and others are not. So pardon me for a second. Not only is the first real act of mankind an act of transgression / an act of using our own reasoning, our own thinking, our own powers of, you could say, mind and soul. But if you look at the actual consequences of the punishment we receive, as much as you're kind of told in Sunday school that this punishment is so horrific and it represents, that we should never violate God's commandments. If you really look at the punishment, got it, Bubakar. If you really look at the punishment that Adam and Eve receive, it really ain't that bad. I know it sounds bad, right? But it doesn't look that bad. And on this other point, in a book that's supposedly about blind obedience to God, if you've ever read not just Genesis, but the whole Bible, but particularly the Genesis stories and Exodus, you will see many characters who represent some of the most important historical figures in the biblical religion. You will see them striving with and in conflict with their own God. Actually, some of the most important religious figures coming out of the Bible are not simply blind, don't have blind faith in God. They struggle with their faith, right? And this is a really interesting, powerful message, number one. Number two, I think it's particularly honest, right? That this is the natural condition of even the most important religious figures, that they actually are in conflict with God as much as they are obedient. It's a story that grown-ups can actually accept, right? If Adam and Eve just went on being obedient forever and ever, like, you really wouldn't take the story very seriously, because we know that's not real life. Whatever the message of the Bible, ultimately, there is so much profound experience. When I say the book represents the accumulated wisdom of the ages, I literally mean that its stories and their messages and their meanings are the product of literally thousands of years of human civilization, and don't simply represent some kind of isolated religious concept or promoting people do this, don't do that, but are often more a meditation on some of the central challenges of our existence. And they don't simply provide simple answers the way we often expect to find in the Bible, or the way it's often presented to us by our priests and our pastors and our imams and our rabbis. And far be it from me as a professor of literature to call into question their interpretation. But I think when we just look at the story, kind of stripped of the institutional stuff that comes, that religion has often interpreted these stories after thousands of years of interpretation, you see something there that's a little different. Like, I gave you this example that nowhere in the Bible is the serpent considered the devil or Satan. It's just not there. Is it a reasonable interpretation? Yeah, sure, it's plausible, but that interpretation is a much later historical, which is to say, long after the Bible was written and read and discussed orally, that concept of the serpent being Satan or the devil or what have you is a concept that emerged hundreds of years later, that was then retroactively kind of interpreted back onto that figure. Okay. Let me pick up with this one more theme in my kind of scatterbrained approach here. The first 5 books of the Bible are called the Pentateuch, and that's just Greek for 5 books. Penta, like pentagon or pentagram, that means 5. Pentateuch means 5 books, right? The other name, well, that's a Greek name given to it, to be quite honest, because the book passed into the hands of Christian Greeks at some point. But the Hebrew name of the first part of the Bible that contains those 5 books is called the Torah, right? The Torah. And the Torah means something like guide or teaching, so on and so forth, right? Why is it called the guide, right? Because this story in particular, but of course the whole Bible, is a recognition that there's something strange and unusual about the human being compared to all other beings in the cosmos that God has created, right? And by other beings, I mean like sun and moon, heaven and earth, fish and fowl, cattle and creepy crawly thing on the land. There's something different about humankind, mankind, that necessitates we have a guide. Other animals don't need a guide to live their life. We do. So when the Torah, you could translate it, among other things, as teaching or guide, right? What it's talking about is providing a teaching or a guide on how to live. And the most fundamental question the human being is concerned with, whether we recognize it or not, is how we should live our lives. We all know we want to be happy. Sometimes we know what to do in order to be happy and we just fail to do it. But the other deeper problem is that we're groping in the dark and we're ignorant. We simply don't have the understanding or the wisdom to come back to the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is really the tree of wisdom, because the knowledge of good and evil is wisdom. It's synonymous. In the text, it's presented as synonymous. So we need to figure out how to live. So we turn to things for guidance. We turn to other people for guidance. We turn to books for guidance. And the Bible then is considered like the ultimate guide for you could either say the human being, or for the Jew or Christian or Muslim, depending on how you want to look at it. And whether you are one of those 3 monotheistic religions, in many ways doesn't matter, because there's sustenance in this book, regardless of who you are, because it's addressed as much to human beings as to specific believers. Bubakar, we're going to come back to your question. I can't say I totally understand your question, but when we get to those issues, you can formulate it again. Okay, so I'll take attendance in just a second. Sorry for the roundabout way here. But what do we want to address here? We want to address the way human nature, or the human being, is kind of the fly in the ointment, right? The beginning of the creation, how does God, does anyone remember? It's 1 and later 2 words. How does God describe his creation in Genesis chapter 1?
He says good.
Yeah, he makes it. And then it's almost like he sits back like an artist and he says, that's good. And then at the end of the 6th day, after the human being is created, does anyone remember what he says then?
It's very good.
Very good. He says it's very good. Now, there's an interesting question of what he means by good and very good. Is this a moral concept, or is this some other kind of idea, right? We tend to think of good as having some kind of moral meaning, but it doesn't have to, of course, right? Especially when you're talking about just the order of creation itself. Like typically, moral descriptors refer to human action, not to like inanimate objects. You don't say the sun is morally righteous, right? It's just the sun, right? So what is that exactly does he mean? Okay, so after Genesis chapter 1, everything is very good. But when the human being comes on the stage, they're like the fly in the ointment. There's something about the nature of mankind that is like the monkey wrench in the machine of the cosmos and disrupts everything from being very good in chapter 1 to by the end of chapter 3. I don't know if you want to say things are very bad, but things are not nearly as good as they were in the beginning, right? And so there's something about mankind in our nature that allows us to deviate from God's order and even his will, right? So there's really fascinating tension, right? So we go, oh, God created them. All they can do, they're like puppets of God. And whatever they do is really a product of his creation and his decision making. But then again, they actually seem to represent their own source of power, their own source of agency, their own source of ability to choose. It's almost like they're quasi-independent of God. And this tension is never perfectly resolved. And it's kind of a tension that, is reflected in real life, right? Okay, so what we want to, the first part of the class here, we want to establish the connection between the structure of creation, which we didn't talk about much last time, and the structure of Adam and Eve and how they are created. And then we'll in light of that, we'll get into the issues of the fall and we'll read that story and get like an introductory look at it. How are Adam and Eve created?
They both were created differently. Adam created by dust, and I guess the breath of forgive me if I'm saying this wrong, but the spirit. And then
Yeah, sure.
Eve was created by Adam rib and flesh.
Good. Is that the only way they were created?
No.
No, the answer is no. What's the other way they were created?
They were
Actually,
created
let
in the
me
image of God.
also qualify this. Last time we talked about this distinction between creating and making. Can anyone refresh us on that distinction?
Creating is from nothing.
Yeah, creating is like, I have no art materials to work with, and I produce them like the rabbit out of the hat. Very good. What's making?
Creating with materials, like from something else.
Yeah, good. So I just wouldn't use the word creating there just to avoid the confusion. But
Yeah.
so making is, we could use the word forming something from things that are already in existence. The sculptor doesn't snap his fingers and make the clay appear. The clay is already there and he takes it and shapes it into a human being or something, right? So the second time they're come into existence, Adam and Eve, they're very clearly made. What is Adam made from in the second creation in chapter 2?
Dust,
Yeah, and the dust comes from where?
the nature, earth.
Yeah, very good. And both answers are applicable here, right? Because it signifies the natural, the imminent, the physical, the corporeal component that he's made from the earth. And the earth has a double meaning here of like clay or dirt, but also like he's literally from the earth. He's an earthly being. He's a mortal being. He's not a heavenly being, right? Well, not quite. What else is in him beside the earth? What brings him to life? Because before, it's like a Frankenstein story, right? And you can see where Mary Shelley got a certain basic concept here. That reminds
Being
me.
their soul,
Yeah, what brings him to life?
The breath of
God's
God.
breath or spirit.
God's breath. And the word spirit and breath are like deeply connected. Like respiration, right? It starts with breath. And in the ancient world, there was a very simple logic to when you knew something was alive, like an animal, it breathed. And when there was breath, there was life. And obvious why that is the case. It's common sense idea. So anything with a spirit on a basic level was, well, I don't want to confuse. Yeah, so only the human being has a spirit, right? And where does the spirit come from? Or a soul? We might even say a soul. The word's not there in this story, but the idea is lurking. Where does this?
God.
Yes. So humankind is a combination of heaven and earth. Humankind is a dual being, a mixture of these two things. Whereas all the other beings are not mixtures. God's not a mixture. He's like pure God or spirit or whatever he is. It's like beyond our comprehension. We talked about a miracle being unknown, like you can't comprehend a miracle. Therefore, the Bible presents the creation as miraculous, and therefore it's beyond our comprehension, and therefore we should have faith. And because reason has limits, it's not that reason is faulty, but it simply can't understand the kinds of things we're talking about in Genesis chapter 1, can't understand the nature of God directly. So the whole theological industry throughout the Middle Ages, trying to like understand the nature of God, understanding that our speech and our reason have limits in understanding God. It's quite interesting. But one way to think about God and his creation, because it's definitely a he's a gendered being here, and there's no mistake about that, is that God and his creation are ineffable. Ineffable. Has anyone heard the word ineffable before?
I actually never have.
Good. That's why we're here, to learn new words. I didn't think most people would know the word, but it's a really good word. And it actually has a meaning that's pretty straightforward. Anyone else? Ineffable?
No.
Okay. So ineffable means just like unknowable or beyond comprehension. It doesn't mean something that's unintelligible, like that it doesn't make sense. It means you can't possibly understand it. So God and his creation are presented as ineffable to human reason, which is precisely why in this story, human reason is relegated to this kind of subordinate position. And therefore faith is the guide to human life. But what's so stunning is how significant, despite that being the primary message, it's notable how significant the role of human reasoning is in this story of picking the fruit. Because clearly picking the fruit somehow is bound up with that, the use of our own intellectual faculties. It's not really a fruit, right? It represents knowledge. It's a symbol. It's a metaphor, right? And if we need to take it literally to understand what's being talked about. But if we just take it literally, we're actually missing the real point. Like this fruit is not like, I don't know, some magic fruit you like get in a video game and you eat and you like grow 10 sizes higher. Like it's a symbol of something. Okay. So, let's just finish up this very quickly. The second time Adam and Eve are created, Adam starts he's made from the soil with the breath of life. And we're a dual being of heaven and earth. Heaven and earth are literally kind of bound together in us. And we are kind of microcosm. Cosmos is like the universe. A microcosm is like the universe in miniature. Has the same structure, but it's like a miniature version of it, right? So the human being's a microcosm. How are we created the first time in chapter 1? Anyone remember? Because for some reason, let's be clear here, for some strange reason, Adam and Eve are actually created twice, chapter 1 and chapter 2. And the important thing is they ain't created the same way each time. And it's not, despite our natural tendency to think in these terms, to just want to marry the two stories and say that it's just a repetition of the same story. These stories are not the same. They're different. And for some strange reason, it's almost like, well, didn't you forget that in chapter 1, you already told us about the creation? Why are you explaining this again? But it turns out these two stories are different, and we can think about why that is. How were Adam and Eve made the first time? Anyone remember?
From God's image.
Yes, it's the creating or the making is not such a physical thing. It simply describes, their essence or something like that. They're made in God's image and likeness. In the image of God made he them, right? It's an interesting line there in chapter 1. In some ways, being made in God's image has a lot of connections with being made of heaven and earth, because to be made like God is to be made like the heavenly things, the supernatural things, the divine things, what have you. On the other hand, they're not gods themselves. They're just like God. They're an image of God. And an image is by definition a dual natured thing. An image, let's just take, for example, a painting. A painting, well, let me give it more specific. Well, here. Well, I don't want to use these because we'll confuse everything together. Imagine a painting, a still life of apples, right? Everybody can kind of imagine that. You think of like Cézanne or something like that. The painting is an image or likeness of 3 apples. They look like 3 apples, but they're not actually 3 apples. They're actually just paint on a surface arranged in a way to make them look like 3 apples. Now, the big thing here is likeness. What kind of likeness are we talking about? Does the likeness, is it similar to the painting, right? Is it a visual or physical likeness? Let me just ask that. Does that make sense that this likeness would be physical or visual? What does God look like? Do we look like God?
I don't think it was meant to be like physical. I think it
Well,
was
that, yeah, that's what I'm asking. So you say no. Okay, good. Why not? First of all, we can talk about the alternative, but why not? Why do you think this is not the concept of being an image and likeness of God is not? Because when we think of images, look, we think of visual phenomena. That's like the word. I would suggest if you looked at like an etymology, a history of that word, it would be tied to like visual phenomena. But why do you think that it's not about being a visual copy?
I think the way it was described, it was more, well, the way I thought about it, it was more like act like God, maybe like have the same characteristics, like personality wise, like God, but not.
Okay, good. Okay, good. Let's just hold off for a second. What does God look like?
Like, we don't know. We don't
Does
know.
God look like anything? Not sure.
Yeah.
What is he made of? Is he made of clay like Adam in the second creation?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, what we do know, we can eliminate. He's definitely not made of clay, right? He's some kind of, he has made physical reality like stuff, but he is outside of the physical reality. And he is not defined by like the laws of physics at all. He's something transcendent of that. So what do you call it? You call it supernatural. What does supernatural mean? It literally means above the natural or beyond the natural, right? So the notion that this likeness issue is referring to physical things, maybe. I mean, in paintings, you will see depictions of God looking like a human, right? I mean, they don't happen often, but they do happen. Eventually, Jesus, for Christians, is considered God incarnate. Does anyone know what the word incarnate means?
Like
In
rebirth?
flesh.
That's reincarnation, when you put the re on it. Incarnate. Somebody said it actually.
In flesh.
Yeah, because it's Latin. And if you know Spanish, carne is, meat, body, corporeal body. So incarnate is Jesus is God made flesh, right? So maybe you could make an argument because he looks like a human, God must look like it, but who knows? I tend to agree that this issue of likeness is not primarily about physical traits, right? Number one. Number two, I think this story articulates an understanding of human nature, and that what's central about our human nature, or what's most important, it has nothing to do with our bodies. When we think of human nature, I mean, I think we always think of our world, for various reasons, we think of biology. We think of organs and the structure of the body and all that stuff. And you go, that's human nature, the physical thing. I think that what the story is most concerned with in human nature, and what it sees really as the true human nature, has nothing to do with our physical makeup at all, right? We'll talk about it more in a moment, but does anybody have thought? This is really important. We're made in the image and likeness of God. What does it mean to be made like God? I don't know what for those of you at Sunday school, I don't know what you learned, but this story, it raises many more questions than it provides clear and straightforward answers. Let's put it that way. What does it mean to be made in the image and likeness of God? If we're not a representation of how God looks, what are we a representation of? What other aspects could be considered? Angelica said something about the way we act and our personality or psychology. I think that's an interesting answer. Does anyone have any other thoughts?
I think
Are
it
we-
could be
Oh, sorry.
like our soul, also the way we think and how we can also create.
Okay, the powers of reasoning. All right, so what you're talking about is like, I think the kind of nice word, faculties. We have faculties of mind and body. What are faculties? They're just abilities. They're just capacities, powers, right? We have faculties to think, to speak, to reason. Obviously, we have faculties of our body to do things with physically with our hands, manual labor. We create things with our hands, not unlike God when he makes Adam. I mean, when God makes Adam from the soil, he's acting like a potter, or he's acting like, a craftsperson. Well, let's ask, we'll come back to this question because we want to move forward here. But to say mankind is like God is to raise an interesting question about what God is actually like as presented in this story, rather than maybe the kind of popular image that we have been indoctrinated with. And I don't mean in a negative way, but indoctrinated through our own religious education or through just popular culture, because these kind of things seep through even in our popular culture that's not like explicitly religious most of the time. We still, there's still basic concepts of God that kind of seep through. And if we're going to understand what it means to be made in the image of God, we're going to have to actually understand what are some of the core attributes of God presented in this story. And you can talk about like God is perfect. The classic ones are God is perfect, God is all-knowing, God is all-powerful, omniscient and omnipotent, omnipresent. He's always present at all places. He sees everything. But the interesting thing is all that stuff about perfection, because all those things of being able to do all that fancy stuff is kind of like an image of perfection, right? Those attributes are not simply on display in this story. And in fact, we are far from what? Perfection?
Yeah, we're far. If I understand that Adam and Eve were built in his image.
So that's why we're just like God. If you take away the like, what's left? We'd actually be God, right? So to say we're God-like, on one hand is to elevate us above the other animals because they ain't godlike, right? But to say we're only like, kind of, sort of, like, like God, is also to say we ain't God. Because to be like him is not to be him, right? To be like LeBron James, because you act cocky, doesn't mean you can do what he does on the basketball court or something like that.
Silly question, but like, are we, when we say we're like God, are we like God pre-Apple or post-Apple? Because pre-Apple, everything seemed to go in a nice pure flow. Once Eve,
let's hold on to, you asked a really good question. And here's my answer for now, because you've posed a really interesting problem that actually ties together looking at Adam and Eve's nature and then also looking at the fall. In chapter 1, we're made in the image of God. It sounds really special. But in the second story, there is no mention of being made in the image of God. We're made from the earth. And then, yeah, I don't want to say anything more than that. There's a problem there that you've picked out that's actually really interesting. What does mankind want to become? What do we aspire to become? Let's say in picking the fruit, what do we aspire to become? As per the serpent's
knowledgeable.
Yeah, and what else? With knowledge comes what?
Power.
What is this? Yes, that's Francis Bacon, but it's also Genesis, and also all our mantras today. Knowledge is power. My daughter's elementary school on 61st Street and 2nd Avenue. Over the door to the entrance to the school, it says knowledge is power. With knowledge and power comes what else? What do we want to be? What do we want? As per this story.
God.
Yes. We want to be God. I don't know, you could say it, we want to be like God, or we just want to be God. What's the moral of this story? Can we be God?
No, I think the way the serpent said it was like, you're going to be like God.
Yes, you will be like them or like him. He speaks in the royal we. And this raises this question of what are the attributes of God that we're aspiring to become? So if we want to be like God by the 3rd chapter, it implies that we didn't start out that way, which is interesting because in chapter 1, it says we're already godlike. Okay. So next week, we're going to start with the other 3 stories or analysis. Bakunin's not really a story, but these are, I don't want to say too much about them because you can read them, but these essentially function as comparative stories in terms of Prometheus, but also interpretation of the story that we're looking at here, particularly the fall. And Milton wrote a famous work called Paradise Lost, in which he basically presents a very expanded depiction of what we're just going to look at a section of it, the temptation of Eve. The temptation of Eve. And because you notice, like, this story, which is one of the most significant stories in all the Bible, is so short and so lacking in detail, and it just leaves so many mysteries for us to contemplate without the text really giving us satisfying answers to them. So Milton takes this story of the temptation, like essentially kind of what was really going on in Eve's head when she picked the fruit, which helps explain why she did it, right? Okay. Okay, 8:24. Let me just come back to this. Oh, let me take attendance. I'm sorry, I'm losing it. Felicia is here. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Philip. Look at this. Or that's Czar. I don't have my list here. All right, so is Balthazar here? No. Gianna. Not sure she's in the class.
Here.
There you are. How are you?
I'm fine.
And Karen,
I'm here.
how are you?
Good.
And Thomas,
Yeah, I'm here.
how are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Great. Yan,
Here.
how are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Great. And Renee,
I'm here.
Ariba, you're here.
I'm here. I just had a question. I don't know if I should ask after attendance or
It's a business question or about what?
it's just about the assignments.
Can we talk at the end of class briefly?
Yeah, that works.
Okay, great. And Nisha,
Yes, Professor, I'm here.
how are you? And
Good,
Clement,
Professor.
great.
I'm here.
How are you, Clement?
I'm good.
And Fahim,
I'm here.
how are you?
Good.
And Delavan,
I'm here.
how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Great. And Faye,
I'm here.
how are you?
Good.
And Sachin,
I'm here.
how are you?
I'm good.
Great. And Kevin,
I'm here.
how you doing?
I'm good. Thank you.
And Anastasia,
I'm here.
awesome. How are you? And Alexander,
I'm here.
there you are. Okay, good. And Nada is here. How you doing, Nada?
I'm Professor. How are you?
Good. Angelica's here. How are you, Angelica?
I'm good. How are you?
And Michael,
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
there you are. How you doing? And Kazi,
I'm here.
how are you?
I'm good. Thank you.
Rosemary,
I am here.
how are you? And Brian is here. How are you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. And Carlos is here. How are you?
Good.
And Natalie is here. How are you?
Good, and you?
Great. And Vicky's here. How are you doing, Vicky?
Hi, Professor. Good afternoon. I mean, evening.
Oh, that's okay. Whatever it is. You can say good morning. I like to say good morning. And Ashley is here. How are you, Ashley?
Hi, Professor. Wait, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh,
Yep,
thank you.
we're good. All righty.
Can you
So
hear me, Professor?
who's that?
Czar?
You're here. Got it.
Yes.
Great. All righty. So let me give very briefly, just quickly, Leon Cass's explanation of why there are two versions of the creation of Adam and Eve. And let me tell you, it's really important because, you know, basically every scholar has accepted this. And the more you look at the story, the more you realize it. It's not an accident that there's two versions. The two versions are not the same. They're kind of discontinuous, and it is not simply a repetition of the same story. It's actually a different story. And here's Cass's interesting explanation. We talked about last class that chapter 1 deals with these big questions of what is there, right? And these questions come not from a moral, social, or practical perspective. They come from like a big philosophical question dealing with just the nature of things and the truth of the nature of things, right? And he says that the answer to the question of what is there, when it includes Adam and Eve, it's from the perspective of these big philosophical matters of what types of things there are in the world. Simply, in chapter 1, God has created a cosmos or a universe what's it? What are the basic things? What are the basic elements in it? What are the basic beings? And when I say beings, like types of things that exist, what are some of them? What are some of them?
Like,
Meaning like the humans, beasts that he was talking about, plant life.
Yeah, plants, animals, what else?
Water.
Yeah, good water. That's actually really important. It comes really early on. It's like primordial. What else?
Sun.
I'm sorry?
Day, night.
Sun.
Yeah,
Day.
sun, moon, day, night. And these things seem to represent kind of like the element. I mean, there's a number of things described, but it's not that many. And they seem to be like the elemental things that God has created. And then underneath them, there may be a lot of little variations and so on. So this thing about mankind being God-like, it's only really, it seems to be only really from this big grand perspective as one being within the context of the whole universe. The problem is in chapter 2 and 3, we shift perspective from this cosmic perspective. It's kind of like shifting from the Google Earth perspective to the Google Street perspective. In Google Earth, the human being is just one little bit amongst the whole situation. But by chapter 2 and 3, we're getting a story that's really only or primarily about human existence and human nature, and eventually the fundamental problems and issues involved in our existence. And from that perspective, we enter something that's much more realistic, and especially by chapter 3, right? What is our world like after we pick the fruit? I mean, we suffer what's characterized as the fall. We fall from this state of grace in the Garden of Eden. We fall from this state of ignorance. What is the world like after the fall? Is it that terrible? Angelica.
I think it's almost like describing a more real world as we know it now.
Absolutely.
Land.
As awful as the fall is, it only looks awful from the point of view of like the utopia in the Garden of Eden. But of course, there are things in the utopia that we might not be so satisfied with as human beings living in the real world, right? So when they pick the fruit, they suffer a series of trade-offs. It's not like a zero-sum game where they just lose everything they had before. They've actually gained some things, and they've also lost some things. Classic, like real world economics. Everything in economics, everything is a trade-off. If you do this, you don't get to do that. And there are, what do they call it? Transaction costs, right? If you get this, you can't get that, and so on. Anyway, one way to look at the fall is, well, shit, Adam and Eve have just been put in the real world. What's the problem with that? Right? But of course, the real world, I mean, this is one thing that characterizes ancient literature, is that it emphasizes very powerfully human suffering and human limit. Our modern world does not like the concept of limits. It does not like the concept of accepting human suffering. We always want to become better and solve all the problems of life. The ancient world has a very different perspective. It resigns itself to human limit, and it resigns itself to some of the suffering of human life as inextricable, which is just a fancy way of saying you can't get rid of it. There's suffering because you're a human being and because the world is what it is. So deal with it. And of course, even then, nobody deals with it well, even in ancient stories, because it sucks, right? But one thing interesting about the fall is it basically looks like real life, right? So it's not the worst thing in the world. Okay. It's 8:34. We're doing okay. I'm just going to kind of blow through these things. So we talked last class about in the beginning. and how the notion that the very concept of there being a beginning to the universe is miraculous, because the basic logic of all science and scientific reasoning is that something comes from something and nothing comes from nothing. A beginning of the universe implies that something can come from nothing, which is miraculous. So that's the first interesting fact here. Even the Big Bang, if you look at the videos that I provided, scientists will claim that before the Big Bang, there was nothing, and the Big Bang was the beginning. Now, frankly, for a scientist to claim that is to claim that a miracle happened. And I don't know why any scientist claims that. It doesn't make any sense to me at all, because ancient philosophers and scientists knew that something came from something. And it meant that there was something before the beginning and something before that. And in the ancient world, the Greeks and the Romans, for example, believed not in the beginning of the universe. They believed in the eternity of the universe, that it existed forever and ever, right? Which is a rather daunting thought, which makes you feel very tiny as a human being, if you think it through a little bit. Okay, so once we move past the beginning here, we get God created heaven and earth, right? And of course, the order of creation also is signifying, like, kind of, you know, heaven and earth are the most kind of fundamental things God has created. And everything else is kind of pervaded with these two elements, right? So we believe in, you know, atoms represent the, well, I suppose there are things smaller than atoms, but let's just forget about that for a second. You know, atoms are like the basic building blocks of the universe. In the ancient world, in ancient Greece and Rome, they believed in earth, wind, earth, air, water, and fire as like the four basic elements of which all things were created, right? And Democritus, I want to say, created the atomic theory that all material things were created from like subparticles called atoms. And they were the smallest particles, like until the 20th century when we discovered there were things smaller than that. And so it seems here that the Bible is making almost a kind of scientific claim and answering the questions loosely. I use the word scientific in terms of what is there. Everything is a mixture of heaven and earth, or these are the kind of fundamental elements from which everything else is going to be made, right? Heaven and earth introduce something that's really vital for understanding what's being described here, which is everything consists of dualities, these kind of binaries of one going with the other. And obviously mankind consists of a duality. We're the image of God. We're like God, but we're also not God. Or then later we're made of heaven and we're made of earth, this primordial mixture. So in us, we are a microcosm of this fundamental division of the cosmos. So this duality, two things being like yin and, everybody knows yin and yang, right? Two things that are complementary, that go together and necessary for one another. The two things really make one thing, right? The other thing about this duality is that it's hierarchical. What do we mean when we say something is hierarchical, or that there's a hierarchy? What is a hierarchy?
Like a ranking system.
Yeah, good. There's a ranking system. Let's just say from the best to the worst, or from the top to the bottom. And everything, one thing we want to spend just a second on here, and then we'll read, is to get a grasp that everything that's being depicted in chapter 1 has a physical orientation that has meaning to it. Let me just scroll down for a second. All right. This is essentially a drawing of what is described in words in chapter 1, right? And actually, to really appreciate what's being said, you have to envision this structure. Now you notice it's like, has anyone seen that Pauly Shore movie, Biodome? That's a 90s thing. You guys probably, that was like probably before your time and you don't watch it. I don't know, maybe you watch MTV. Does anybody watch MTV anymore?
No.
Good. It's probably good for humanity that you don't. Okay, so there was a movie called Biodome, right? So here's our dome of it's called the firmament. And you notice that the earth is not exactly flat and it's not exactly round either. And the whole conception of the cosmos is radically different from ours, because for us, everything's in like 360 degrees and the earth is floating out in space, right? Here, and technically speaking, there's no up, down, left, right orientation in space, because any point could be considered up and any point could be considered down. You can like change the orientation whatever way you want. It's like, ask yourself, what's the top and bottom of the universe? The answer is there's no answer, because it's whatever you decide it is. In this depiction of the universe or cosmos, everything is oriented up, down. What's at the top and what's at the bottom? What's at the top and what's at the bottom?
The top is heaven,
Yes, and at the bottom,
the earth.
yeah, earth, and in Hebrew it's Shoel, and it's kind of the early start, how should I put it? Articulation of hell, basically, right? But heaven and earth. And these two concepts of heaven and earth are hierarchical. Heaven is above the earth, and heaven, because it's the place of divinity, is superior to earth, right? And therefore, everything depicted in this story has a hierarchical relationship in relationship to this orientation of up and down, or heaven and earth, right? So as you go up, things become more important, more powerful, more divine, of greater worth. As you go down, they become less important, less powerful, less worthy, and less divine, right? And so everything in this story, even though it's not illustrated literally, has this hierarchy in mind. So here's my little schematic with basically the same thing with heaven and earth, right? Up here, going down, and the earth here rising up to the heaven. And what's in the middle, right? The human being, right? So you've got like fowl and fish, you've got creepy crawly things and cattle. They're on the land, the dry land, but humankind is upright, vertical. And literally in their, walking on our 2 feet and standing upright compared to the other animals, in a sense, we're literally closer to heaven simply from a physical point of view. And we're also the being that like doesn't look at the ground. Think of a dog. They look at the ground and they look at the horizon. But there are very few animals that spend their time looking up. And what's up? It's not just the sky, it's not just stars, it's not just physical phenomena, but that's the realm of God. And I mean, you think about, we desire to be like God. We desire to ascend to that realm. Anyone know the story? You should have read it, of the Tower of Babel, or the Tower of Babel. What's the story of Tower of Babel?
Is it that humans start to congregate and kind of talk to each other to reach God again?
Yeah, well, not to reach God again quite, because they've never been, they've always been kind of separated from him in a certain way, because while we have you could say the spark of God in us, or a certain amount of God in us, we're also the mortal terrestrial being of the earth, right? We're of the flesh, right? How did they hope to get to God? The people of Babel or Babylon.
By building this tower.
Yeah, they build this is a version of historical events. It's obviously mythological, but it has a basis in historical fact. So in ancient Mesopotamia, talked about last week, they built these things called ziggurats, which are step temples, which are basically designed to be like man-made mountains. They're kind of like pyramids, but they're a little different, and their function is different. And they ascend above. They're a building that goes above the ground, and they literally ascend to heaven. And the idea was, as you literally, walk up this thing, you're literally going closer to God. And that's taken quite literally under this whole orientation of up down, where, God, if he resides anywhere, it's somewhere in the heavens. If we're going to have some contact with God directly, it's going to be somewhere in the heavens. And so what do they actually hope to do as they build this? It's basically like a skyscraper is what they're building. And our modern day, what do we call it? The Freedom Tower? What is the World Trade Center called? The Liberty Tower? I can't even remember.
I think it is the
Freedom Tower.
What's that?
Freedom Tower.
The Freedom Tower. Because we're a beacon of freedom around the world. Well, we ended our mask mandates. That's very exciting. We can make our own personal choices about things like that now again. So what's the story? Why are they building this thing? What exactly do they want to do with this thing that's like a skyscraper? And our modern day skyscrapers are an echo, symbolically and not by accident, of things like the Tower of Babel. They ascend into the heavens. Of course, we don't believe there's anything up there anymore except space, but the symbolic nature of it remains. What do the people from Babel want to do by building this tower? This is really important because it connects in with the story of Adam and Eve picking the fruit.
Did they want to get back into the garden?
Not the garden. You've got the right idea, but they don't want to go to the garden.
They want to be closer to God.
They don't just, if only. They don't want to just be closer to God. They want to be what?
God.
Yes. So this is a story about, mankind is the middle being, stuck in the middle of this order. We're not too big. We're not too small. We're like God, but we're not God. We're an animal, but we're superior to the other animals because we have this spark that the other animals haven't been given. And what is one of our fundamental ambitions? This is what the story seems to be telling us. What is mankind? Number one, we're an ambitious being. We want more. We desire more. We don't accept what we have. We don't accept being merely mortal human beings with reason and all that stuff. We don't even want to be like God. We just want to be gods, right? And of course, this can be taken metaphorically. We don't have to take it literally, like human beings want to be like supernatural beings floating in the heavens. But the point makes itself. I mean, what do you think about those people with penthouses on skyscrapers, living way above you little people down on the streets of New York? Compared to you, they want to be like gods. They want to be superior to you. You can watch some good analysis of, people just talking about the significance of, buildings built up in the sky and people having penthouses looking down on the little workers while they're superior. So they don't just want to be like God, or they don't want to be close to God. They want to be God themselves. And this story of the Tower of Babel is an assault on the heavens. It's, Putin invades Ukraine. Well, the Babylonians wanted to invade heaven, and and have a coup against God and kick him out and take over themselves because we're arrogant and we're ambitious as human beings. He gives us a little power and we think we can take that little bit of power and like take it all the way, right? And what they do, I mean, at least the idea of the story is that they build this ziggurat on the dry land in Babylon up to this thing called the firmament, right? And the firmament is literally the dome of the heavens. So we go outside and look and everything looks like a kind of dome, like in a snow globe, but we don't think there's like an actual physical solid edifice that makes the dome shape of the sky. It just looks that way visually. But for them, there's literally like a dome, like you'd have a dome inside of a building, right? And when, you know, there are holes in the dome that allows for the rain to come in and so on and so forth. And the dome is the thing that actually holds out the water. It's a complicated story because this is also the heavens, but there's also water above. It talks about the waters above from the waters below. The waters above come down as rain, and the waters below, you know, bubble up in terms of like oceans and streams and springs and all that stuff. So they literally want to kind of like break through the roof to get to the heavens. And what does God do to them and their ambition and ingenuity? So these are obviously clever people and they're ambitious people. What does God do to them, to the Babylonians or people from Babel? How does he stop them?
He makes them not being able to communicate, like.
Yes. So this is a story that it does a number of things. One thing, it's supposed to explain why there are so many different languages spoken on the earth, and also why the earth is divided up into different nations. Because for the most part, and the simple thing here in the story is that each nation is a language group, right? And it also explains the conflict on the earth. These different nations, because they're different, because they can't communicate, they're in conflict, and they can't coordinate to assault the heavens and become like God, or just become God. And of course, God, you know, the hilarious thing is, what are the chances of the Babylonians succeeding at their task? What do you think the chances of them succeeding, of storming the heavens and having a coup against God?
0 now because they can't work together.
Yeah, good. Well, 0 from the beginning. Why? Because let's just say God is all powerful and he ain't going to let it happen. But what's one of the real interesting morals of the story? Is not that God succeeds in stopping them. It's that despite the human beings having they should have known better, they do it anyway, right? They do it anyway. Okay. Let me just 2 more seconds here and then we'll read. So this is the order of creation. Cass talks about some really interesting things about the strange order of the order of creation, that, like, for example, there's light and dark and there's day and night, but at this time there's no moon or sun to create light or dark, day and night. And you notice that there's light before there's the sun. And these kind of interesting ambiguities. And the first reaction is, oh, this is incredibly unscientific. Why is this in this, discombobulated order? But Cass gives an interesting explanation for this order, despite the fact that it doesn't conform with historical facts that we assume about the order by which some of these things came into existence. Okay, so one really important thing about this order that we've just talked about, and I just want to show this slide briefly, is that there's a cosmic hierarchy, or it's often described as the great chain of being, with God and heavens, the heavens and the divine at the top, nature at the bottom, like earth and water and so on, and man in the middle, or humankind in the middle, a mixture of number 1 and number 3, right? So we're the middle being, we're a dual natured being who's a synthesis of numbers 1 and 3, right? And here you see God on a throne in heaven, and literally a chain, literally the great chain of being here, connecting all the realms of the universe, from the realm of the angels to the realm of human beings, to animals, plants, earth, and then down to hell, all in this unified singular order. Okay. Let me just, okay. Very briefly here. The order of creation culminates in the creation of Adam and Eve. And Cass talks about creation by separating from something else. And that when one thing is separated from something else, it's differentiated, right? So we get this process of separating something from nothing, which means before there were heaven and earth, there was nothing. And then from nothing, God, you could say, pulls out or separates something from it. When he first gives that something, heaven and earth, and it talks about the waters or in the, you know, the shadow and the spirit on the face of the deep, and it's really mysterious. It's like he has stuff now. He has materials to work with, but it has no arrangement. It's a chaos. Chaos means something that's lacking order, right? So when he first creates the material from which everything else is going to be made, it's the material is now there, but the artist, you could say, has not given it structure, right? Then he starts giving it structure by establishing Earth, which is now not just the physical substance, but it's like dry land. It's the planet Earth. Once and he builds the firmament and the dry land, so it's the earth above and the earth below, keeping out the waters above and the waters below. And so place is the arrangement of stuff into order. Then you get the introduction of motion when the sun and the moon are talked about and acknowledged that they move in the sky, right? And what is motion? It's literally the separation of a thing from its original place to another place. So when you have place, you don't have motion yet, you don't have time. And then, so the things that move first are the sun and the moon. They move in the sky, right? The celestial bodies. Then we get to another type of motion in the process of the types of things that are created, locomotion. Anyone understand what locomotion is? What is locomotion? What is locomotion? Let me ask this. Do the sun and the moon move themselves? I hope everybody gets this answer right. How they move. What makes the sun and the moon move?
Gravity?
Yeah, do they make themselves move?
No.
No, this is really important. The sun and the moon move simply because of physical laws or physical forces that follow laws acting on those bodies, aka the sun and the moon. Locomotion is self-motion, where a thing propels itself, like an animal, or I don't know, a robot that has a battery in it or some such, right? But primarily in this story, we're thinking about animals. What causes the locomotion of an animal? Well, it's no longer just physical laws. It's we could just call them biological laws. Their biology impels them forward in their life based on like survival instinct, and they move, but they move instinctively. They don't really think about the way they move. They don't make choices about how they're going to move, because that for the most part, they're hardwired animals that move as a consequence of the way their genes, their genetic makeup has disposed them to move. They don't make choices, right? So the laws that animals follow, for the most part, because obviously you can train them to certain degrees and it raises some complications, but they follow biological laws, the laws of, you could say Darwin even, to preserve themselves. They through instinct. And if you're following instinct, you're not making choices, right? And you could say, what's the classic thing that directs or guides an animal? Remember, Torah is teaching or guide, right? Guide to life. We have a problem with guidance in our life. Animal does not have problem in guidance with life because they function on instinct, hardwired genetic stuff, right? And what's the classic analysis that Aristotle gives? They respond to external stimuli, pleasure and pain, right? Of course we do too, because we're animals, or a special kind of animal. And they seek things that are pleasurable, and they avoid things that are what? Painful, right? Because that's how most animals stay alive. If you pursue things that are pleasurable, well, we're made in a way to pursue things like, and so on. Human beings, however, don't have locomotion. Cass uses the word human beings have action. And by action, he doesn't just mean something physical about our motion. When you think of the sun and the moon moving, it's just a physical action. It's the result of the physical laws of the universe, like Newtonian laws, right? Kinesthetics, right? But the human being does not just move, we act. And this is a word, I mean, this is not unique to Cass, but human action is not just movement. Human action is about voluntary motion, which is to say we choose to not just move, but we choose to do certain things. And the parameters of what we do, first of all, when we live, we don't talk about I move in, like this morning I moved out of bed and I moved this. You say you do things and it signifies something different, right? We don't just follow pleasure and pain as our guide through human life. What defines the boundaries of our actions? It's not just pleasure and pain, it's what?
We can think about if they're good or bad.
Yes, we think not just from, obviously we're animals, we think in terms of pleasure and pain because we want to avoid painful things and seek pleasurable things, but even the pleasures and pains we code in moral terms as either good or bad, or good or evil, or just or unjust, right and wrong, and so on and so forth. And the interesting thing is, you know, people always talk about morality as some kind of separate domain of human experience. But everything we do, we give moral codings to of some kind or some or another. Like this is either the right thing to do or the wrong thing. This is the better thing to do. This is the worst, the less good thing to do. Right. So our lives, all our actions, because when we talk about action, what are we really talking about? We're talking about living. And the basic question this book is dedicated to, in essence, is how should one live one's life? And why is this a problem? Because we don't live just by physical laws like the sun and moon. We don't just live by biological laws like other animals. We live by moral codes, by moral laws. Forget about the fact that there are disagreements about what's moral and what's not, or what's good and what's bad. That's part of the problem. We have disagreement from our own human point of view. Can you break the laws of physics? Can you break Newton's laws of matter and energy?
No.
No.
I hope not. Otherwise, we've got some serious problems. Can you break the laws of biology?
You can manipulate things.
Yeah,
so-
sure. Actually, when you manipulate things, you are actually leveraging those laws that you cannot break, and you're exploiting them. Actually, Francis Bacon has an expression, something like to have power over nature, you have to obey nature, something like that. To have power over things, you have to obey the physical laws and understand them in order to manipulate them. Can you break moral laws?
Yes.
Absolutely. So this is the first big problem of human action. Moral laws are not set in stone in the way physical laws are, so to speak. They can be broken. God creates one moral commandment. Do not eat, thou shalt not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What do?
We take from the tree.
Yeah, we violate the law. And it's actually the very first act. Act is not just a motion. It's the result of a choice, a decision. You know, it's like when people act virtuously, they're not just moving their body. They're doing something based on conceptions of right and wrong. So the first problem of human existence is, you know, moral codes can be broken. And then the second thing is, what is the right thing to do? It's not just the Bible that acknowledges this. It's actually all philosophy dedicated to like ethics and morality, which is that using our reason to determine what is right and wrong raises questions that really have never been completely solved in all of human civilization, right? Because what's right, the question itself poses problems that are almost inexplicable or ineffable. So we want to do the right thing, but we struggle to know what it actually is. And the other thing is this, because we're human beings, because we have free will, we're like the fly in the ointment. All these other things in the order of creation functions on God's laws. Physical law, I mean, who created, from this story, who created these things? Physical laws, chemical laws, biological laws, that's all God. He created a moral law for us too. But guess what? We as human beings, you could say the free will, we have the agency, we have the power to choose. We have the power to choose to break God's law, right? And here we see what every story can only be a story if there's a problem or a conflict that becomes the kind of the nub, the rub that needs to be addressed and that people grope to solve, right? We see the problem of human existence as per the Bible in this issue that we have the power to do the right thing if we can know what the right thing is to do, but we also have the power to deviate from God's commandment. And if you want to see how perverse this story really is, we only really become human when we violate God's commandment and we take our lives into our own hands. And we can talk about more that issue next week, because normally students have a lot of interesting disagreement about, you know, boy, I think it's better we just broke the rules because, like, I don't want to be like Adam and Eve and stuff like that. And then there are other people who say it's obviously wrong to break God's commandment. Like, what are you talking about? It's an interesting little conundrum we can have a kind of dispute about. So for the remainder of class, let me see what's here. You know what? Let's just read from the beginning, and we won't do too much commentary on chapter 1, but we'll do a little bit on chapter 2, because there's the creation story there. And then, excuse me, we'll focus more, we'll finish really focusing on chapter 2 and the implications of the way Adam and Eve are created. Let me just look here for a second. Okay, good. I've got everything. And then maybe we can start reading into chapter 3 if we have time, and we'll pick up chapter 3 at the very beginning of next class. Could I have a volunteer to read for us?
I'll read. Am I reading just, oh no, not just the highlighted. I'm starting from in the
Yeah,
beginning.
start
God
from the
created.
beginning. Good question. Yeah, start from the beginning. In the beginning.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made
so the firmament is the kind of dome that keeps the waters out from our realm. Like you look up at the sky and then you look down at the earth, there's the earth below your feet. And in theory, this story, there's the firmament is literally like a crust of earth that keeps out the waters from above.
Okay. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters. And oh no, I read that, I'm sorry. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called he seas. And God saw that it was good.
Good.
And God,
all right. So little thing at verse. So so you've got chapter 1, verse 10. You notice here the dry land is called earth with a capital E, because earth has two meanings. It could mean soil, or it could mean the planet Earth. So you notice up here in verse 1, E is lowercase because it just refers to like soil. It's just like unshaped material. But then earth is not just made of soil, but it's shaped in a certain way, and it occupies a certain place within the order of everything. And that's what makes it the planet Earth as opposed to just the stuff. All right, you want to keep going?
and God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth. And it was so. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after his kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind. And God saw that it was good.
Okay, let's pause there for a second. God goes through the day, he makes some stuff, and he says, okay, I'm up at the end of the day, I'm going to stop making stuff. He looks at it all, says, that was good. What do we think he means by good here? I mean, the moral concept of good really applies to human actions, right? What could good mean here? Is it the opposite of evil?
Yeah.
Could be. I mean, one thing that's interesting here is there's heaven, earth, man, woman, stars, moon and sun, all these binaries that go together. And you notice that there's good, but no evil. And for obvious reasons, the dilemma about God being the author of evil. And we don't see the binary of good and evil until the tree, which doesn't come till chapter 2. What else could good mean? Because obviously we know it has other shades of meaning. What else can good mean besides morally good? What does it mean to call the universe that God has created good? What are synonyms that could be used?
Beneficial.
Yeah, I think, yeah, sure, beneficial. But beneficial to whom? Beneficial to what? It's not really, this is like just a description of what is, as opposed to a description of what it's for. If it's beneficial for something. Any other thoughts? How is it good?
Could be like it's well put together.
Yeah. So I'm inclined to believe that part of, maybe even primarily, that this good is about, he's saying it's perfect. And the question is, why is it perfect? It has nothing to do with more. I mean, obviously it's not evil. Well, I mean, it's complicated because evil obviously has some origin in God. I mean, this is always the question because it's his universe, but that it's perfect because it's structured perfectly. And after day 6, he doesn't say it's good. He says it's very good. What has he done at the end of day 6?
He created
He
earth,
created male and
man.
female.
Yeah, he creates a man and woman. Is there how much more of the creation does he have to go after day 6?
No more creation.
Yes, he is
Done.
done, which means the creation is complete, right? If you're talking about the structure of something, the structure can't really be perfect until it's complete, because if it's incomplete, the structure is really not totally in place. Okay. Natalie, you want to keep reading?
Sure. And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give them light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw it was good. And the evening and the morning were the 4th day. And God said, let the waters bring forth abundantly the moving creature that hath life, and fowl that may fly above the earth in the open firmament of heaven.
So this is great. Now we're talking about creatures being defined by their moving creatures. A creature is just the thing created by God, the thing created by the creator. That's just what a creature is. So you notice the sun and the moon are also creatures. They're creatures of God. They're things created by God. So now we get to the moving creatures, where we're not dealing with the acting creatures, but just the ones that move. Fish and fowl.
And God created great whales and every living creature that moveth with the water, which the waters brought forth abundantly after their kind, and every winged fowl after his kind. And God saw that it was good.
Great. I'm sorry, you keep reading. I'll shut up.
And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let fowl multiply in the earth. And the evening and the morning were the 5th day.
Okay, so let's pause it after the 5th day here, and we can rest like God. So a couple things. So we're reading the King James version of the Bible, right? It was translated and published in the first few decades of the 17th century, right? And its language is, of course, challenging in terms of some of the words, moveth and so on, creepeth. And then, of course, the sentence structure is complicated because it has grammatical structures that are a little bit alien and foreign to us. But this is good work for preparing ourselves for Shakespeare. Why the King James Bible? Why not read the modern Bible that sounds like modern English? Well, 2 reasons. 3 reasons. Number 1, honestly, for the challenge of it, right? Harold Bloom says, the pleasure of reading comes in the pleasure of difficult challenges, something to that effect. The other thing is the modern English versions very often edit out significant things in this text. And they kind of like, they make it modern, not only from like a linguistic point of view, but from a kind of from a modern worldview. And it really distorts the meaning of this text, whether we like it, whether it's not, whether it's politically correct or not. This is what the text is, right? It's kind of like Mark Twain. He's talking about slavery. You can't get around it. You don't have to like it, but that's what it actually is. And maybe we shouldn't like it, but maybe there's other types of ways of looking at it. So the last thing is that in terms of the English language and English language literature that draws on the Bible, the King James version or the King James English is kind of like the English. It is the edition of the English language that has shaped literature for hundreds of years that makes biblical references, right? And I know it's awkward at times, but there's a certain poetry once you kind of get comfortable with the sentence structure. Okay, one other thing here. God blesses his creation. And in this case, we're talking about living things. And he blesses them by saying, be fruitful and multiply. And of course, you notice that like he says something in one verse and then it gets made in the next one. And it's literally his saying that like brings things into existence. His language has special powers that ours don't. Our language can describe things, but his language can create things. Think about it. God said, let there be light. And there was light. Think about that. He said the word light before there was actually the physical phenomena of whatever this thing he calls light. There's no sun or stars. This is a special kind of light, it seems. What does it mean to bless? God blesses his creation.
Like to give it his approval?
Yeah, it's even more specific than that, but that's absolutely correct. What does it mean?
His holy approval?
Yeah, he sanctifies his creation. He makes it holy. He gives it a certain special status, right? And the way he does it here is it's fruitful and multiplying. What does that mean? Be fruitful and multiply. He's talking about like all the living things on the earth.
Oh, reproduce, right?
So fruitful means it reproduces. Well, multiply, both words kind of touch on it. Multiply definitely means reproduce. What's the fruitful part? I mean, they're synonyms really, but they touch on 2 related concepts. So when things multiply, they are what? When they reproduce, they are what? Are they many or are they few?
Many.
Yeah, so not only are they like fecund and they reproduce because they've been blessed, but it produces they're bountiful. They're bountiful. There's lots of it. So think about it. Adam and Eve are going to live in the garden that is fruitful and multiplying. They live with abundance, and God lets it be known you can have all the fruit, just don't eat one. And of course, that's the one they want. It's very funny, actually. So here God blesses and sanctifies. After the fall, what is God going to do to everything and everyone? He's not going to bless them. He's going to do what? It's an antonym to bless.
Curse them.
Curse.
Yes. So it's really important you see the kind of symmetricality or the kind of parallel thing here. Before the fall, everything is blessed, it's fruitful and multiplying. Afterward, he curses Adam and Eve, he curses the snake, and he curses the ground itself. He curses the earth. What happens when God curses the earth? Let's just say it's the opposite of fruitful and multiply. Anybody remember when he curses the earth? What happens to it?
I don't remember, but it's.
So
I
when he
think instead
curses
of being
Adam and Eve,
fruitful,
he makes their lives miserable. Adam has to work now for his bread from the sweat of his brow. Eve, it says something, multiply thy sorrows in conception. So she's going to suffer giving birth. She never had that problem before. And then he curses the ground. He curses the earth itself. And the Garden of Eden is no longer the Garden of Eden. I mean, obviously they get kicked out, but they're no longer living in a world that's fruitful and multiplying. What is the world they live in now? Why does Adam have to work? It's not just that God makes him work.
To survive.
And why is that? Why does he have to work to survive? Whereas in the garden, they basically didn't have to work to survive.
Because he has to work the land. The earth doesn't work for them anymore. They work for the earth.
Yeah, I mean, something like that. Let me just clarify it. So, because we're out of time here, but the earth is no longer yielding up its bounty easily and generously. You now have to like extract it from the earth. And you can only extract the resources you need through lots of labor. And it introduces the concept of, what's the economic concept that's being introduced here after the earth is cursed?
Scarcity.
Scarcity. Yes. Right? I mean, the Garden of Eden is like a Marxist utopia, right? Everything gets provided and nobody has to work. I ain't never seen that society before, but we're going to get there someday, I hear. So, you know, God creates scarcity and forces Adam to work. And of course, the work isn't just work, it's getting his daily bread, quite literally, because Adam's going to be a farmer, right? And he's going to plant the seeds in that soil and work hard to get them to grow, whereas before nature just did it all on its own, right? Okay, so we will pick up next week, and I still want to touch a little bit on the second creation story, but we will get into the fall, and we'll start looking at oh crud, we're going a little slowly here, but we will start looking at Milton in particular next week. And I'm going to make some references to the Bakunin reading, but I'm not going to focus on it too much. And actually, Bakunin will help us with kind of understanding what's going on when they pick the fruit. Okay, so thank you, everybody. It was a lovely class. I really appreciate the participation. I encourage those who have not spoken to chime in going forward, and those who did, I marked that down in my attendance, like things like reading aloud, commentary, it all gets marked down and goes, you know, it positively influences your final grade. Absolutely. So really crucial. So if there's anyone who has, some people had some business questions, I can get to now.
Professor, regarding the midterm, it says on the syllabus it's due March 12th. Is that still happening?
No, definitely not.
Okay.
So I've gotten a little behind on messaging. Tomorrow, could you send me an email right now about that?
Sure.
Yeah, don't worry about that.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions?
I had a question pertaining to the reading assignment.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just me, but I put a lot of time and effort into answering the questions, but I just want to make sure that I'm doing it correctly and to the right standard. So when do you think you're going to have some more comments on those?
Okay, good question. So, I mean, I think the main comment is just going to come through my grading. And unfortunately, I've had some personal things pop up, but I am going to get to grading in the next couple days. And if you have any more specific questions, once I grade, we can talk about it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. But really the commentary should come through the grade. And if you've been putting in the time and, you should be just fine. Cause yeah, that's all I should say about it for now, because it's pretty simple, but I will be getting to it. And if you really have any concerns after that, we can certainly talk. Yeah. Other questions? All right. Thank you all. Have a lovely night. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, Professor.
Thank you very much. Have a great night.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.